Great. Hello and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce Achim Steiner, the administrator of the UN Development Program. Achim, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. And while not yet in person, at least we're a little bit closer. We're both in New York. And so I'm really excited to speak to you at the beginning of this very busy week. And I wanted to start by talking to you about the UNDP's new strategic plan. So, the new strategic plan has a lot of pretty lofty targets. You have some ambitious goals, helping 100 million people escape extreme poverty, 500 million people access clean energy, 800 million people participate in elections, and mobilizing about $1 trillion in public and private finance. So diving into some of these issues, let's start with COVID. One of the things we're seeing is increasingly this gulf of inequality is widening. Especially as we look at vaccinations and the economic recovery and the speed at which that's happening. Tell us a little bit more about how UNDP is working towards that. I know you're particularly focused on sort of the economic and social response to the crisis. And what's your message this week on what's needed from COVID? This is a moment when global leaders gather. Do you feel there's been a lack of global leadership on this? How might this week change that? What's your sort of message?
Well, first of all, I believe firmly, as I think the Secretary General, our Deputy Secretary, and many member states have also said, coming out of this pandemic, this is an extraordinary moment in time. Therefore, extraordinary measures are also called for. Now, again, you might say that's easily said, yes, but let's also acknowledge, if we simply try to go back to where we were, we will come out worse, even 3 to 5 years after this pandemic, to where we were before. And therefore, I think that underlying sense in many countries, amongst younger people, older people, is that something has to change. And I think we clearly need to, first of all, decide whether we're going to spend a lot of time on debating the targets and indicators and timelines, or whether we're going to refocus on the Sustainable Development Goals as our shared agenda, both as a way of acknowledging the times we live in, but also the ways in which we need to work together across national boundaries, but also across sectoral boundaries. The SDGs are often underestimated in terms of their development design logic, being very much an intersectoral and a systemic approach to the great development, risks and opportunities of our time, but also they are uniquely contemporary because they are a declaration of interdependence. Remember, in 2015, it was Secretary General Ban Ki-moon who then called the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda a declaration of interdependence, the first development agenda that explicitly acknowledged that what happens in wealthier or developed countries is of equal relevance to the future of developing countries and vice versa. So I think coming out of this week, we first of all need to have a commitment to having the SDGs as our common agenda. Secondly, we need an SDG push scenario. This has been very much UNDP's attempt to try and use future scenarios to identify what are areas in which we could significantly enhance investments, given both the stimulus packages, but also the responses to the economic crisis, the social crisis, but also the environmental imperatives to act, climate change being just one of them. And here I think we are convinced, and this is very much the message, that we have had a major setback. There is no two ways about it. But it is not a reason to either be hopeless, as the Secretary General said this morning, or to feel helpless. We need to now make decisions that require us to be far more strategic, courageous. And yes, there I think we have seen over the last year both extraordinary acts of courage and leadership, and extraordinary failures in leadership and lack of courage. So for us as the United Nations, as a place in which countries come together to discuss a way out of this crisis, but also as the development program of the United Nations, we are laser focused on the recovery choices and priorities that countries must now make. And we can obviously discuss further in which areas this will play out. But I think the SDG push idea is very much one that unequivocally states that coming out of this crisis, we need significant investments with the logic that underpinned the SDGs.
Well, I think we'll get to the challenge of financing some of these issues later, but I wanted to talk to you about one of the key themes this week, which is about energy. You're co-chairing the high-level dialogue on energy, which will take place on Friday. And one of the things I've been sort of thinking about and looking at in this context is I think, especially in the lead up to COP, we're, talking a lot about climate mitigation, what's needed to sort of get things under control. And it seems there's also an emerging tension then with this goal of energy access, particularly in low income countries, I would say particularly on the continent of Africa, where, they produce barely, 0.5% of total emission, and as we look at some of those challenges and as we look to the dialogue on Friday, what do you think we're going to be hearing? How do you see that debate sort of playing out as we move forward?
Look, Adva, I think it's important, first of all, to recognize that it's not an accident, perhaps, that after 40 years is this the first UN real high-level event on energy. This is, I think, a reflection of, first of all, the recognition of how central energy is to what happens to development in general. And secondly, it is also a recognition that the energy sector as a whole, or the energy foundations of our economies, are about to go through the most profound period of change, perhaps, in the last 100 years. In fact, I would argue that we are already in the midst of an energy revolution. Now, what is critical is, however, that we first of all recognize that SDG 7 is about energy. It's about access to energy. It's about the transition to cleaner energy. It's also about energy efficiency. So this is not a summit about climate change, although clearly climate change and the energy transitions in terms of decarbonization are a key driver. And as UNDP, we have from the beginning, together with my co-chair and also the Secretary General, argued very strongly that this should be a summit that is, first of all, taking SDG 7 at its face value, which is these three areas in which, and others indeed, that it prioritized. It's a key foundational piece of a development trajectory for any country. So access to energy combined with access to clean energy might have been a, perhaps difficult set of dual objectives to meet 10, 15 years ago. I would argue very strongly, Adva, that in the year 2021, any national economic planning institution, any advocate for a strategic approach to the future competitiveness of an economy cannot in any seriousness argue that you should invest in a fossil fuel, carbon-intensive energy infrastructure. And indeed, renewables have become a shortcut for access to energy on the African continent or indeed in other countries.
So I want to push you on one thing here, because I think that one of the debates is around gas, right? So I think people, rightly say coal is probably not part of the conversation anymore, but particularly in low-income countries where they do need a lot more energy generation and need it also for industry, not just at the household level. There's a lot of people who argue, including a lot of leaders of African nations, who say it is patently unfair to say that we can't develop any additional natural gas when some of the world's wealthiest countries continue to do so and continue to use that as a key part of their energy mix. And so I wonder where you stand on that, because I think that sort of debate between low-income countries and high-income countries, particularly around gas, will be a critical issue as we look at the climate debates moving forward.
Well, let me be very frank. I think it's damn unfair. It just is one of those historical, facts or realities that countries who discover oil, gas, or coal 100 years after other countries have discovered it suddenly find themselves in a very different era. And from that point of view, I have a great deal of sympathy for countries who would say, look, we need a just transition. I mean, you can't just suddenly say, well, sorry, you are a latecomer. Therefore, bad luck, gas is not an option for you. But, frankly, I think in history we have also seen these things can often be distractions also of where real decision-making is needed. Is gas a transition fuel? Absolutely, it is in the industrialized world. It will be in the developing world. Is it one that will last 50 years or 15 years? Well, a lot will depend on what happens with energy in general. I think if you look at just the economics of renewables, if you look at the public consumer choices also that are happening, markets will move much faster than many people anticipate right now. So if you are a developing economy, yes, it is absolutely legitimate to say, look, we have found a fossil fuel, we want to sell it onto the market. First of all, we're not going to stop using oil or gas in the next 5, 10, or 15 years. So are we really disagreeing about what is the most central issue, which I actually think over time will very quickly become much more peripheral? The real question is, how does a country like Nigeria, how does a country like Ethiopia, South Africa, Egypt, think about the future of its energy infrastructure, of its energy matrix, of actually taking advantage of the extraordinary technological revolutions that are happening in terms of renewable energy, first of all, production, secondly, storage, thirdly, economics. And then, energy sector decisions are 20 to 40-year cycle decisions. So any leader who is looking at the future of their energy matrix right now must have an inclination to move towards renewables faster. Otherwise, we're really setting yourselves apart. So I think what we have to recognize is that the direction of the future of energy is clearly in the direction of a decarbonized energy infrastructure. But that's the whole point of just energy.
One quick question is, do you think we'll see on Friday, can you preview any sort of specific commitments that we might see along those lines? Give us a sense of what we might expect.
Well, I believe the high-level dialogue on energy and also some of the compacts that have been put forward by countries, by companies, by organizations, essentially are showcasing leadership in terms of structural transformation, moving towards a decarbonization goal on the one hand, but also in particular context, access to energy. UNDP put the 500 million people gaining access to energy, clean energy, at the center of its energy offer, or rather sustainable development offer, precisely for the reason that we believe that addressing the access to energy issue is central to developing countries. Making the clean energy revolution work for access to energy is a fundamental building block of a modern competitive economy.
So one question on this front, because I think as we look at achieving that future, a key element is financing. And with some of these issues, the cost of storage is still quite high. We're sort of waiting for technologies to scale to bring down those costs. And obviously you have quite ambitious mobilization targets in this new strategic plan. And $1 trillion is a lot of money in a 3-year period. And, sometimes I can be a bit of a cynic. I know we've talked about sort of how markets are changing and how UNDP can sort of play a real catalytic role in trying to facilitate some of that change and activating some of this finance towards the SDGs. But do you think it's actually happening? Is there proof there? We are seeing a growth in ESG and in bonds that are tied to social or environmental issues, but we're not necessarily seeing the evidence that is translating into positive outcomes. So where do you think we stand in this financing piece, and what's UNDP's role in that moving forward?
Well, first of all, both personally and now as head of UNDP, I have always considered what happens in the domain of finance as fundamental to what happens in our economies. It's the lifeblood, if you want, in the veins of our economies. So our challenge is, how do we incentivize a financial sector, a financial marketplace, to actually invest in technologies, in energy infrastructure or transport infrastructure that is less harmful to our future? And in that sense, UNDP's policy work, first of all, with countries looking at emission standards, looking at their national climate strategies, looking at their energy strategies, is all about trying to achieve a development outcome with the least possible cost in terms of either pollution, environmental destruction, or indeed leaving too many people behind as an outcome. At the end of the day, we are an advisor to development. We are not even an investor in the sense that we lend money or become a shareholder, so to speak, in projects. Our role is to bring best practice, best policy to a national design process where development choices are essentially sovereign choices. But having said that, you see, there are not enough results. I mean, look at the extraordinary story of renewable energy in the last 10 years. I mean, for anybody to say this is not real is to deny a simple fact. And first of all, the cost per kilowatt hour is today almost the most competitive of any energy source in most parts of the world. The amount of money that is both public and privately being invested in renewable energy is growing exponentially. In the middle of this pandemic, we have seen the stimulus packages bring more finance to investing in clean energy than we would have dared to imagine just 18 months ago. So I would say we are, and that is why I said earlier on, in the midst of an energy revolution, in part driven by the climate change imperative to act, but also enabled by essentially, firstly, a technology and cost competitiveness, and secondly, I think just a consumer choice. People don't want to see their money being invested in things that do harm. And energy is the lowest hanging fruit that we have in our world today in terms of being able to accelerate this transition to address the climate change threat, but also to create jobs and create access to energy. So the energy domain, I want to also be careful here, because sometimes we take energy as if it's sort of a goal on its own. It links to poverty reduction, it links to industrialization, it links to, for example, also job creation. That is what is at the heart of UNDP's approach to try to take the Sustainable Development Goals. And if a country says, look, energy has to be a priority for us, then our role is to help, country X or Y design an energy pathway that at the same time deals with issues of inequality, of poverty, but also of development opportunities. That is the approach that we would like to bring to national decision-making in its own sovereign right, but with the benefit of both global expertise and experience. And finance, clearly, domestic and international, is going to be a central enabler here.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we are out of time, and that's unfortunate, because I could always talk to you for much longer, and I always enjoy our opportunities to chat and getting your perspective on what's going on and what UNDP is doing. So thank you so much for joining me, Achim, and I look forward to the next time we can speak.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Adva. Bye-bye.